Hello, this video is on the idea of autarky, prompted by recent commentators' observations of Donald Trump's administration that the US actually has become rather autarkic. In fact, I think the Washington Post previously declared that we are now back again in the age of autarky. So what is this thing or this idea called autarky? Well, it's an economic system that promotes self-sufficiency and limited trade. And of course, there are varying degrees of autarky. So the most extreme case, a complete state of autarky, is when the economy is totally closed and it does not engage in international trade with anybody. So in the 19th century, for example, Japan in its isolation phase could be described as an autarky. And of course, in the 18th and 19th century, the mercantilist policies of Western European countries show varying degrees of autarky. Nazi Germany, of course, wanted to be an autarky, and today North Korea and its system of so-called self-reliance is a pretty close example of extreme autarky. So obviously autarky is the opposite of a liberal economic system which we have gotten used to through globalization. So all our current beliefs in interdependence and in international trade and globalization, these are all contradicted by autarkic ideals. Now, in my research, I found Spain in the 20th century to be an interesting example of autarky under General Franco, whose, in hindsight, misguided policies which tried to aim at economic self-sufficiency and the state control of prices and industrial development, cut off from an international market. That apparently, according to one study, led to national income falling to the levels of 1900. So it's regress, not progress. Industrial production fell, agricultural output stagnated, real wages plummeted. So autarky historically has been demonstrated to have detrimental effects. However, economic nationalism and protectionism and state intervention, all these attributes of autarky continue to come back to life. You know, they're like zombies, they never die. And in the case of Spain, which I will explore in some detail, it's quite interesting because Spain, under General Franco, who proclaimed in 1938 that, quote unquote, Spain is a privileged country which can be completely self-reliant. We have everything necessary to live, and our production is sufficiently abundant to ensure our subsistence. We have no need to import anything, quote unquote. So this idea that Spain could and should aspire to economic autarky actually came before the economic disorder brought about by World War II. And so it wasn't in response to any external influence, even though General Franco and his collaborators later would allege this. So in other words, Franco proceeded out of the conviction that achieving autarky was the right thing to do. But of course, this turned out to be grievously wrong. Now, actually, it's important to recall that autarkic policies have been noted to reduce welfare and were observed to be harmful in other ways. As early as 1848, John Stuart Mill remarked, "But the economic advantages of commerce are surpassed in importance by those of its effects, which are intellectual and moral. It is hardly possible to overrate the value, in the present low state of human improvement, of placing human beings in contact with persons dissimilar to themselves and with modes of thought and action unlike those with which they are familiar. Commerce is now what war once was, the principal source of this contact." And Richard Cobden held the same view, quote unquote, "I believe that the physical gain will be the smallest gain to humanity from the success of this principle, that the free trade principle shall act on the moral world as the principle of gravitation in the universe, drawing men together, thrusting aside the antagonism of race and creed and religion, and uniting us in the bonds of eternal peace. The effect will be to change the face of the world so as to introduce a system of government entirely distinct from that which now prevails. So in other words, the opposite of autarky can help to promote world peace. Now, ironically, the so-called father of modern protectionism, the German economist Friedrich List, who is also sometimes blamed for autarky, actually in 1841, in vindicating the prominent role of the state and the primacy of the nation over individuals, did favor protectionism for historical and political reasons. But what's interesting is that List criticized the mercantilist system, and that, in his opinion, protectionism was not desirable in the long term. For List, protection and state intervention were requirements that derive from the historical circumstances in which the supreme interests of the nation were immersed. So from a more human perspective, he admitted the ideal scenario would be to seek increasingly close relationships through free trade, promoting peace among nations until a universal union was attained. So protectionism, is an intermediate step if it's actually necessary. And even somebody like List had to concede that actually the end point should be peace among nations, and that trade rather than protectionism would contribute to this. So that's an interesting observation, because there are many people who point out that List is associated with autarky, but perhaps this particular aspect of List has been a little bit ignored. And so moving on, we have noted that autarky can be sometimes an intermediate objective, and that this is something for which the subordination of economic development to political requirements was necessary. But in the case of Spain, this is because Spain wanted to become as industrialized as Germany. And so autarky was advocated in order to catch up with the industrialization of Germany. And of course, in this respect, they advocated the attempt to erase the import of consumer goods as quickly as possible. And using the old autarkic formula, the Franco government sought growth in agriculture, industrial import substitution, protectionism, restrictions on consumption, and especially the country's demand for fuel. So, and this actually led to the development of research and technology within France that focus quite clearly on the Spanish community of scientists, with the view to controlling Spanish scientists within Spain. So there is actually a knowledge angle to this, which is that in becoming autarkic, Franco's Spain actually also tried to foster a Spanish community of scientists with its own publications cluster that cut off Spain from much of the rest of the world. And of course, still on Spain, it has been noted that from 1939 up to 1975, it was the most peripheral country in Western Europe, because it was last in establishing closer links with the institutions post-World War II. And actually, until 1959, Spain maintained substantial political and economic isolation of her own accord, because Franco's regime bet on a model of largely isolated development, and that isolated development actually gave a distinctive flavor to technology and applied science in Spain, which is fostered by a particular scientific journal's economy within Spain that also contributed to autarky in Spain. Now, moving on to something a little different, which uses the concept of autarky as well, which in fact relates more to industrial ecosystems and the environment. It might be a surprise to people that in fact the concept of autarky is also applied there, because there is a so-called island logic, which is a kind of self-preserving autarky. Basically, that's the idea that if different countries operated like islands, or if different industrial systems operated like islands, then this kind of self-preserving or self-sustaining autarky could be an alternative to what we have today. Now, of course, we know in philosophy, islands have been studied as possible utopias or ideal societies that have a high degree of well-being because the inhabitants are living in some kind of ideal state. So in philosophy, we find this. And a key attribute of these so-called utopian islands is to build communities on the principle of autarky. So autarkic systems are supposed to function in a self-sufficient way, satisfying all internal needs with their own resources and demonstrating their ability to exist independently of any external assistance. Now, so this notion of a self-preserving autarky is the notion that you can sort of recycle resources, and there is a particular island apparently in the Pacific cited by certain authors that provides a prime example of an island population that strove for self-preserving autarky. It's called Tikopia, located in the Solomon Islands. And the authors of this particular study, Timo, Busch and Alice Sakhel, actually point out that when transferring the island logic of Tikopia to the mainland, the basic idea of self-preserving autarky implies developing island-like units of industrial operations on continents that in the ideal form are completely decoupled from their environment and only use resources at a pace at which they can internally regenerate. So it's a circular economy. No material or energy exchanges are allowed that are not within the scope of naturally occurring exchanges on these islands or island-like units. So that's quite an interesting idea, actually. And international trade here is, of course, we know it as economically indispensable for prosperity. And in fact, the island of Singapore is the poster child for globalization and international trade. And Singapore has become prosperous through openness, through interdependence, through globalization. So the belief is that through exchanging resources and products, participants can generate economic benefits and balance resource flows on a more aggregate level, ensuring the global use of scarce resources at relatively low costs. Okay, so free and unbounded trade assumes that resource mismanagement is not so problematic, and it's the idea that trade is economically viable, physically feasible, and it's a good way of providing industrial systems with the necessary resources. So, but some people argue that as a result, international trade has been shown to encourage excessive and unsustainable resource use. So global trade and autarky represent polar ends of a continuum of how societies approach resource use. And it's debatable whether it's okay to move from one extreme to the other. It's debatable whether this is even possible in the short term, because trade has brought economic progress, and it's a little dubious whether anybody wants to switch towards an island logic. In the long run, though, these two authors argue, in the long run, that there could be an advantage in establishing industrial systems that strive for self-preserving autarky rather than continuing to expand an economic system based on globalized trade. And these two authors advocate shifting from the current trade dogma closer toward the alternative pole of the trade autarky continuum, and that it could be a key mechanism to steer industrial systems onto a more sustainable path. So this is a debatable position taken up by these two authors, to which, by the way, there is a response, because it is by no means this island logic. It is by no means uncontroversial. So, for example, a rebuttal to island logic would be something mounted by an author called Jeroen van den Bergh, and in a letter to the editor of the journal, Jeroen van den Bergh actually points out that actually a key reason to not go for autarky is that the spatial distribution of environmental resources, interpreted in a broad sense, is very unequal. I mean, we know different countries have different resources, and that, for example, certain islands like Singapore have practically no resources or have very limited resources. So if there's no international trade and there's no hinterland, then what's going to happen to all these populations located in less endowed places? You know, that's a question. And of course, the problem is that this could lead to conflict. And in the history of the world, for example, in the history of China, resource-driven conflict has been well documented. For example, the Mongols in the north would invade, hence the need for the Great Wall of China, because they were resource poor. So island logic doesn't seem particularly good in considering the unequal spatial distribution of environmental resources. So not allowing for international trade in such resources or the products based on them would mean arbitrarily creating very different opportunities for welfare achievement among countries. So then it's a question of luck. The luckiest ones would have many resources, whereas the unluckiest ones would have nothing, practically. Okay, so that doesn't seem a very satisfactory situation to have if we really take seriously island logic. The other reason to be skeptical about autarky is that these different distinct resource opportunities can create different development paths that create economic and political tensions. I mean, that we've pointed out, it can lead to war. But of course, it also leads to different development levels. In fact, mutual economic dependence is good for trust building and reducing conflicts. It's a form of reciprocity that you can find from the individual to the state level, and also it's arguably responsible for a trend of less violence and more cooperation. So trade is a good thing, and exchange and trade are the logical consequence of specialization and labor division, as Adam Smith pointed out. You know, it's good for everybody. Everybody benefits through international trade rather than protectionism. And this specialization and exchange, in fact, characterize the historical development of human societies. So instead of planning for islands of autarky, we should fight and negotiate for good environmental policies around the world, and which will make products, their consumption and production, cost relatively, it will make products whose consumption and production cost relatively more environmental pressure more expensive. So in other words, pricing can be used, or cost can be used as a signal of what's consumed in order to what products are more expensive to consume and produce. Okay, so international trade of so-called dirty goods is punished in two ways: through the higher cost of their production, as well as their long-distance transport. So what this means is that good environmental policies will stimulate more autarkic economies in terms of very dirty goods, but not for cleaner ones. So such an environmental policy is politically also more feasible, right? Since it integrates smoothly with our current open economies, and international trade allows everyone to benefit more broadly from opportunities for recycling and reusing across nations. Okay, so international trade has magnified, of course, it's undeniable, has magnified unsustainable resource use, but really this is to be blamed on the lack of good environmental policies, not trade itself. Okay, so as scientists, or as part of a good scientific understanding of the problem, we need to distinguish the proximate cause from the ultimate cause of a problem. I think that's important. Okay, we must be able to pinpoint the real underlying cause of a problem. So, of course we can learn from so-called island logic, but probably Busch and Sakhel don't really want to claim that countries should no longer trade at all. Instead, I think the objective, as Jeroen van der Bergh points out, is to do something, okay, to overly pollutive or resource inefficient products. So the idea should be to reduce trade of products that are too cheap, that are produced in a pollutive or resource inefficient manner. So that's probably the whole point of the consideration of island logic, and it's worthy of consideration. Now, in the context of autarky, it's actually quite interesting that in the economics of defense, or the production of weapons, production and sale of weapons, in which the United States is dominant, even the notion of autarky plays a role. So, for example, Jonathan Caverley points out that liberal theory says that it's more cost-effective and technologically advanced weapons get produced globally, and that even the United States will acquiesce to increasing defense globalization even as it restrains US power. However, realist logic dictates that the US would resist defense liberalization to retain self-sufficiency. Jonathan Caverley, of course, points out that actually this is a false choice, in the sense that the US can encourage defense globalization in order to extend its international political influence. And that's a very interesting argument that he makes. Modern weapons, he points out, modern weapons are very complex and need economies of scale. But in fact, the systems integration technologies of, especially of US arms companies, makes it possible for United States to reign supreme, and it's in fact an advantage for the US to at least partially globalize the production of weapons. like the European Union countries, for example, in order to spread its international influence. So the political culture of the US tends to be autarkic, especially as regards defense and the defense industry. But Caverley actually argues that it is a good idea to globalize some defense production, because this is tantamount to spreading American political influence, and we note, of course, that since the Cold War, the United States has in globalizing, the United States has had a very key advantage in defense production and sales. But why is it that in an increasingly secure post-Cold War era, why does the US continue to invest aggressively in military research, fostering globalization and intensifying technological sophistication and consequently the global production of its weapons, if it is not to the advantage of the US? So I think Caverley makes an interesting point that states do not live by autonomy alone these days, and that some really brilliant people in the US recognize this even for the defense industry, and that the United States prefers interdependence to autarky, at least certain quarters, even in the relatively sensitive area of the defense industry. So, and of course, the European example is transnational and less autarkic, and Caverley uses this as an example of the possibility of transnational cooperation. But then, the thing is, we seem to be living in a different world now, where economic efficiency may not matter so much, and who knows whether some of these people that Caverley points out have this longer term, more strategic thinking about spreading US influence. I mean, who knows whether or not these people still have any influence within the US. So that's an interesting point to consider. I mean, it's thought-provoking what Caverley points out. So it's worth thinking about in the context of autarky, I think. And of course, to round off, to finish, Klaus Schwab has written an article in Foreign Policy advocating against autarky, even though he recognizes that economic cooperation is now being eclipsed really by geopolitical competition, or rather that politics no longer lags behind global economic forces. I think the last few months, or 2020, has shown the importance of politics, and of course also of health security and food security, and it would not be a surprise if autarkic tendencies became stronger and stronger. So, but however, Klaus Schwab points out that there are 3 areas which require international cooperation, okay, and depend on autarkic tendencies getting controlled. These 3 priority areas, he points out, are taxation, especially of modern tech companies, taxation, climate change, and workers' rights. These 3 areas, and that to improve everybody's lives in the world, these 3 priority areas need work. They need work because we have to be rescued from a negative equilibrium which the whole world seems to be heading towards if autarkic tendencies were to prevail. So those are some ideas on autarky. I hope it stimulates you to think more about its relevance for our modern world. Thank you. Bye.